Next, we'll close up this animator, and we'll name it Move. We can add different properties to this animator by clicking the flyout menu next to Add. Here I can select some other properties, and those properties will be applied within the range selector we've just created. We can also add a selector. Here we can add a new range selector, a new expression, or a new wiggly selector. Let's use a wiggly selector. Our wiggly selector is now inside of our range selector. So anything inside of this range selector is going to get a wiggly value. I can open up the wiggly selector to see all of the different parameters inside of it. Its mode is set to intersect. So as this wiggly range intersects with the range selector above it, it's going to change the value of any parameter inside of the range selector with a minimum and a maximum amount. Here I can define the maximum and minimum amount and even animate them. Just below that, I can see that the wiggle factor is currently based on characters. By clicking on the pull-down window, I can see that it can change this value again from characters to characters excluding spaces, words, or lines. We'll leave it at characters for now and close up our wiggly selector. Now, all of the modified values inside of our position parameter are going to be wiggled based on our wiggly selector and from the value that we've given our position. To keep this in order, we'll name the wiggly selector. We'll name this Move, then a period, Wiggly, so that we know that this wiggly selector is being applied to the word Move. We'll navigate up to the range selector and change the name of this as well, naming this Move, then a period, and Position. I'll close these and the entire animator. Next, I want to animate the word twist, but this time with a different range selector. So I'll click on the word text, then with the flyout menu from animate, I'll choose rotation. Again, this range selector is going to encompass all of the text. Here under my range selector, I can see that it goes from 0 to 100. I'll close this up, then use a simple rotation. I can see that it's rotating all of the characters in the phrase. So I need to modify the range selector so that it only modifies those characters in twist. I'll click and drag the start of the range selector to about 31 and click and drag the end selector as well. Now if I don't want to click and drag the value for the end selector, I can do this by moving the cursor up to the comp window, then hovering over either the start or the end of the range selector, the icon will change to a range selector icon. This means I can modify the range selector simply by clicking and dragging on it. Again, I can add a wiggly selector to this in order to modify the values of the rotation. So under Add, we'll apply a wiggly selector. Now all of the values inside Twist are rotating around. If you find the word Move on the left-hand side a bit too distracting, we can turn that off by simply turning off the visibility for the animator. We'll go into the timeline, then for the animator called Move, we'll turn this off. Let's rename our current animator while we're here. Additionally, we can rename the range selector and the wiggly selector as well. Currently, the rotation occurs around the baseline. If I change the value of the rotation more, we can see that the wiggle occurs at the anchor point for the text, which runs along the bottom of the phrase. In order to modify this, we can simply add a parameter to control the anchor point. However, if we add the parameter here by clicking on Add, then adding the property for anchor point, then modify the Y value of the anchor point, we can see by clicking and dragging in the timeline that the wiggly selector is going to change the values for the anchor point as well. This makes the anchor point jump around just as much as the rotation value. Instead of this, we need a range selector that doesn't have the wiggly selector attached to it. All we have to do is select the twist, then duplicate it. We'll close this one up to reveal twist 2 down below it. I'll rename this one called twist offset. I'll open up the values for twist offset and see that the wiggly selector has been duplicated with the rest of the parameters. All I have to do is select it, then delete it, and on rotation as well, I can select and delete that parameter. Now all I have is the range selector that's been duplicated and the anchor point value that's been modified. I need to remember to go into the original animator for our twist and delete the anchor point that wiggles around. We'll close this up, then modify the anchor point so that each character rotates around the new anchor point. Now by clicking and dragging in the timeline, we'll see that each character rotates around the center, but the position of the entire word is too low. I'll modify this offset parameter with a position change. So here I can add position. I'll simply modify position for the same change that I made to my anchor point. Now the characters appear in line with the rest of the phrase, but the offset for the anchor point allows each character to rotate around its center. So I'll close this up, then choose text, and create a new animator. The last thing I want to do is animate the scale. So I get a new range selector, and I can modify this by simply clicking and dragging on the range selector in the comp window, and I'll simply choose Shout. Next, I'll change the scale, but I'm going to break the link between the X and the Y value. Again, I'll go to Add, then add our selector for Wiggly. If I click and drag on the timeline now, although we have a value for scale, the Wiggly selector isn't changing the values. Instead, I need to change the scale from its default value to something new in order for the Wiggly selector to modify it. So I'll change the scale for Y to something a little bit larger. As I change the scale larger, we can see that Wiggly is actually making some of the characters much smaller. Let's take a look inside the Wiggly selector. Inside our Wiggly selector, we have the ability to change the maximum amount and the minimum amount returned by the selector. With a value for minimum amount at -100, the Wiggly selector is able to push many of the values it returns back to 0. I want to change the value so that the Wiggly selector is not going to be able to modify it -100%, but only maybe 60%. Now I can see here in my range, it will go from 60% of the original modification up to 100% of its modification. I'll rename this Shout Wiggly, then close it, and rename the range selector and the animator as well. I'll close all of these up, then turn on the animator for move, twirl up my text parameters, then at the bottom of all of these parameters, you should see some layer styles that I've already created for this layer. All we have to do is turn those on to make those visible. Simply, it's a glow and a little drop shadow. By turning off shy layers, we can turn on the audio associated to the layer and the funky speaker animation that was created with some shape layers.